Good afternoon and welcome to the Preservation Association of Lincoln Brown Bag Lecture Series. My name is Eileen Burkton. I'm the coordinator of these lecture series. Our videotaping today is sponsored by the Preservation Association of Lincoln. Our speaker today is Timothy Mahoney. Timothy is a professor of history and the project administrator of the Plains Humanities Alliance at UNL. He is a specialist in 19th century United States social, urban, and regional history. He is also the author and co-editor of 3 books and many articles. One article from which this topic evolved is the Great Sheedy Murder Case, the Booster Ethos in the Gilded Age Lincoln. And this won a 2001 James Seller Award for the best article published this year, or that year in 2001, in Nebraska history. His topic today is Exploring the City Digitally, the Gilded Age Plain City Digital Project. Please join me in welcoming Timothy Mahoney.
Thank you, Eileen, and thank you to the Preservation Association of Lincoln for having me here. It's been a while, and it's been a long time, and I encourage and I welcome any efforts by people who are active in trying to maintain the built environment of the past of Lincoln and the history of Lincoln, keep that in our memory, to interact with this site. This site has been up for about 17 months now, and I want to thank the various entities involved in developing this site. Of course, the Plains Humanities Alliance, of which I'm the coordinator, was involved in funding for this. But we had a partnership with the Center for Digital Research in the Humanities at the University of Nebraska, thanks to Kay Walter and her extraordinary team of co-workers who have built this project. Really, it's those folks who did the technology. And likewise, we've had support, important support from the Nebraska State Historical Society, who provided us free access to many of the documents, and they helped us with all the scanning that was involved in the middle stages of the production of the project. Now, what I'd like to do today, sort of informally, is talk about the project. And for those of you who haven't seen the project, I encourage you to go to it and to browse it and to absorb yourself into it. And I'd like to sort of give you a little tour around the project. And then I'd like to provide a bit of a commentary on the project, a commentary on the facts of the case that's at the core of the project, and then sort of a series of reflections on where we are now as I think about this project and its ability to just keep drawing me back. I first encountered this story of the Sheedy murder case back in the mid-1990s when I was working on a CD-ROM with NET. Netcha, Lois Dahm, was the coordinator of that project, and I was asked to write a series of sort of biographical portraits of Nebraska towns and cities, of which one was Lincoln. And I used the old-fashioned method. I didn't feel I had a sense for the lived experience of Lincoln life in the late 19th century. So I used the old-fashioned method of going to the microfilm machine and just cranking through the microfilms. And voila! In January of 1891, I picked up one of the articles about this. It just exploded across the newspapers of the time. It was an extraordinary event, and suddenly it just kept growing and developing. That led to research that took me a while to make a commitment to get into. Because I've got other things on the table and other things that I've got doing. This satisfies my real inclination to local history. I call this history out my window. My old father office looks out over the landscape of downtown Lincoln. Everything that happened here happened within about 3 or 4 blocks of the campus. Not everything, but most things. And it literally is history out my window, and I like that connection between what I do in my academic work and what I do in terms of trying to provide the place where I live with some sense of the stories that percolated through its past and made up its past. So this is a lot of storytelling, and really the core of this is a great story, and I really want to emphasize that. So let me try to work this and lead us through this. I'm seeing something a little different here. This is going to be a little awkward, and I apologize for that, but I want to make sure that we get to where we are. If you want the story, the great story, go to Interpretation and Narrative. On the site is the scan of the award-winning 2001 article. That's when I worked with Don Cunningham and his staff to create this this sort of novelistic narrative of this great murder case story, a great whodunit of the 1890s. And there's a lot of interest in that, generally in the culture. You see books like this appearing quite regularly, or crime stories of the late 1890s. I just had a long conversation with Joel Williamson, who's an author from Alexandria, Virginia, who's published a brand new book called The Barrel House Boys. And he thanks me in the preface of that book, his novel. He's doing an 1894 case. He thanks me for all the things that he was able to get out of this site. He used this site almost primarily for the research and getting into the Gilded Age life of the Plain City. And this is an elaboration that comes from all of the data that we were able to assemble and to scan, and that's in the data set at the back of the site, I guess. But it is a great story. And the story, the very quick of it, let me do it in 2 minutes, is that John Sheedy, who was a noted booster and sporting man and a gambler in the city of Lincoln, Nebraska, he had his casino where Boomers now sits and has sat for many years at that corner of the square. And he was walking out of his house at the southeast corner of 12th and P, and on the evening of January 11th, 1891, somebody came out of the shadows from the light on the porch, struck him very hard over the back of the head with a steel cane, obviously an instrument meant to do damage, and he staggered. He pulled his gun, indicating that he was armed, and he shot several shots into the dark to the west of his house, down toward the alley that went south of his house, and across to 13th Street, where the assailant apparently ran. Immediately, what strikes me about the immediate aftermath of the event is that it startled the neighborhood. The affidavits and the testimonies in the case indicate that there were a score or more people on the streets in that winter evening, indicating it must have been a fairly mild January evening. I'm making a supposition. I've actually never gone as far as check the temperature on that evening, but you get a sense that there were an awful lot of folks. A couple of doctors quickly rushed over to the house. Mary Sheedy, his wife, came from inside the house, pulled him back into the parlor where he was laid down on the couch. He was clearly bleeding badly. They thought he was doing okay. He then was given a number of painkillers. He was put to bed, and during the course of the night, he went into a coma and never recovered from that, never came out of that coma. And 26 hours later, on Monday evening, he died of his wounds, and you suddenly had yourself a homicide in Lincoln, Nebraska. Now, that then led to this flurry of interest from the police department. Obviously, the police were on the spot within minutes of the event because the police department's main office was only a couple of blocks away, pretty much where I think it's where the back of the Embassy Suites, across from where the back of the Embassy Suites would be, near to the back of the Lead Center there. And the police were there immediately, and they began to take testimony from Sheedy himself, from the witnesses on the street, and they had an ID on somebody who was an African-American man who some described as of mild-mannered sort of fellow, although it was a violent sort of act. He was a debonair fellow, and quickly they realized that this was somebody who was very well known in the realm of O Street and P Street, and in the uptown area, and that was Monday McFarland. So very quickly they drew the conclusion that they knew who they were looking for, indicating the small venue in which we were operating at the time. And they started a manhunt for Monday McFarland. And they had a pretty good idea very early in the case who he was and who they were looking for. But when, of course, Sheedy died on Monday, then it became a murder case, a homicide, and they were looking for somebody who was going to be charged, if they had the evidence, with murder. They apprehended him 4 days later on P Street. He was out on a bender. He was arrested. He was brought to the jail. He was put through a process that seems very strenuous in trying to elicit a confession. He gave a confession in the middle of the night. They threatened him that there was a mob outside on the streets wanting to take him away and do lynch justice to him. Not a threat to be taken at all lightly in the 1891, one of the highest years in terms of the frequencies of murders in the United States, only followed up by 1892, which was the peak year of lynchings in the United States. He then confessed, and in his confession, he confessed that he was in a collusion with the wife of John Sheedy, Mary Sheedy, that they were together in a relationship, that she had somehow coaxed him with the promise of money from John Sheedy's estate to murder her husband, and she would finish the job if he didn't complete the job with the violent act against him, the cane. She would provide poison, and that's where you get the charge against both Monday and Mary Sheedy. Mary Sheedy and Monday McFarland are both accused of murder. Charges are made. And then you have the scramble for lawyers and an extraordinary sort of legal effort. William Jennings Bryant was briefly involved in this, and for a while he was going to be McFarland's lawyer. And boy, it would have been a whole different thing, wouldn't it have been, had he said yes to this, but he backed away from it for reasons that aren't clear. I think the more powerful lawyers in town were the ones who nudged their way in. Strode and Stearns were longtime Sheedy family lawyers. And then you start all these legal actions of making the charges, having the arraignment and the hearing, and suddenly I'm reading in the newspapers an extraordinary level of detailed accounts of what people were doing on the evening of January 11th, 1891, giving the historian a remarkable opportunity to explore in really a microscopic way the story of the life of the 1890s in Lincoln, Nebraska, and also the facts of the case. Now, for a while, the story itself, the work that I had to do was just to get the facts of the case down, and I think this is an extraordinary account of the facts of the case. In this case, on the site, we've added lots of amplification to this. We've particularly here, what I like, I see the spin as sort of would be your contemporary equivalent, and I guess we're not getting the full screen here, but over here you get the contents on the right, and this is all brand new material that's with the site, which would be your contemporary equivalent to the spin on, say, CNN or Fox News or something, people commenting on the case, on the facts of the case. An extraordinary legal discussion about the coroner's jury. Why did the coroner's jury close the door? Coroner's juries in Lancaster County to that point were public events. If you wanted to go to the courthouse where there had been a murder and see the body being examined and the coroner trying to make a ruling, you could do that. It was a public event, but this coroner decided to close the door and make it a private event. That was a highly debatable issue at the time, and that would, of course, become a later practice. Likewise, the confession would become the core of the entire case. Was it true? Was it spun out of whole cloth, as some of the newspapers thought? Was it just simply a yarn that he used to try to somehow get himself off with a story that no one would possibly believe? That became the core of the whole thing. Really, the legal issue there is whether or not it was delivered under duress. I think in contemporary frameworks, it wouldn't really pass muster, and so it would be a problem from the beginning here. And then there were other legal issues, and this spin is a whole part of the case that has been elaborated, and we give a whole detailed account of the arrest and the confession, of the trial itself, and each of these are provided with blow-by-blow accounts in the newspapers, and if you want to not let, oh, I lost it there. Each computer does it in a bit of a different way, but I'll go back and I'll try to get it. If you want to basically ignore our interpretation and you want to read the newspaper's accounts, we've taken all of the newspaper's accounts, scanned those, and they're able to be enlarged, and you can literally read the newspaper. I know people who visit the site who've done nothing but just read the newspaper all the way through, because that's really fascinating to do. See the language, see what they're able to say compared to what they're able to say today. It sounds a lot like what you see on the spin on late night cable TV, CNN, etc., rather than what you see in newspapers today. A really elaborate kind of reporting, and many debates being raised about the entire case. And so I'd like to indicate that. But as I was pursuing this case, and this is obviously going to be a bit of an issue because this keeps coming up every time I come up, so maybe. As I kept pursuing the case, what really was gnawing at me was the central question: why did this case create such a furor? That's the core issue. Why was this such an extraordinary case? Or why did this case, as Genio Lamberson, the impressive prosecuting attorney who failed in his prosecution, remark after the case, "No event has ever taken such a hold on the public mind, awakened such profound interest, excited so much discussion, or plowed itself so deeply into the public, into the life of our people." I just like that sense, plowed itself so deeply into the life of our people. People were really obsessed by this case. There was something going on that is at the core of the case. So that's when I began to broaden the framework of a whodunit into trying to turn it into a social, political, cultural, and economic history to understand what was this case, what was the context of the case, and what were the tensions that were roiling just beneath the surface that the case seemed to just bring to the surface, and everybody said, we've got some serious problems. This was a pervasive problem of the 1890s. Americans believed at the time that the system was corrupt, that there were tensions, ethical tensions, tensions about reform versus status quo continuing as the way things had in most cities, which is a pretty wide open kind of environment, particularly in western cities. And likewise, this was a decade when the rather deeply organized system of society, the Victorian system with clear delineations between classes, between white and black, men and women, had clearly shown signs of cracking and eroding, and that people were crossing those lines, and they were beginning to think about a society that was more modern and more open and less rigid and restrictive. And so this is the larger kind of framework. And so I started to explore these kinds of things, and much of the article sort of touches on these things, but I felt frustrated there. So this gives me an opportunity to really kind of explore the things going on around the city. And that leads to my attempts to try to tell whole stories that were going on. Very briefly, my first assumption was that I was sort of downplaying the excitement of the story because I assumed murder wasn't that infrequent in the 1890s, the more violent sort of sense we have of the urban past. But I was wrong. We had as few murders back then as we have happily today in Lincoln. It was one of the first major and notorious murders in Lincoln, and that itself was a shocking event. The facts of the case are shocking enough, one would argue, that it was notorious. But it really focuses on John Sheedy and who John Sheedy was. And to get you a sense of who John Sheedy was, somebody for whom I don't have a photograph, somebody for whom I have no biographies, no autobiographies, any kind of letters from him, I had to figure out a way to try to get you a sense of who he was and what his life was like. And so as I began to think about the article that I wrote in 2001, and then think about what wasn't there and why I wasn't entirely satisfied with that, I started to think that I wanted to give people a sense of who he was by putting you back in the world that he lived in, the place that he occupied. And this gets to the notion of spatial narrative. So we began to think of the idea of somehow spatially presenting the city of Lincoln, Nebraska, and that led to my desire to establish, well, you see this is coming up differently, and we may not get to the interactive map because this now is indicating that there's a phishing filter on here. So in any case, I'll have to speak differently about it. At your computers at home, you can get to the, let me just try a few things here. No, that's not getting me to the interactive map. So one of the things I've learned about digital projects is every computer takes it differently. See, it's not responding to the digital map, and we've had this issue before, and I guess I should have shown that as well. But I think it's pretty easy to describe what the digital map is. If you go back to that city, we simply took a program that took each of the spatial units, the squares, the blocks in the city, and broke them into sub-blocks, and then assigned a unit in which we would put all the data in detail into those units. And so you could scan the city. You could look for. We looked at we then categorized them in each different ways according to industry, according to class, middle class, working class, etc. And the booster ethos, the bench and bar, the demi-monde, et cetera, to give you a sense of the spatial relations of a 19th century city. And you can do that at home. I mean, your computers at home will work. There's a phishing filter of some sort on here that's preventing the interactive map from working. And I've had this happen before. I've had the whole thing not work. And this tends to happen occasionally. So in any case, I'd like to sort of indicate that the goal there was thinking about a spatial narrative, to think about John Sheedy's kind of spatial narrative. And so if you go to the interactive map and you type in Sheedy, you'll see that he's got his, we can go to the photographs at least and get a sense of the square. If we try to go to the spatial narratives, if you get spatial narratives of each of the realities in which these people in these different areas lived. John Sheedy would have been in the male subculture, which was that male world of winking at conventional morality, hanging out in bars and saloons, and John Sheedy was called one of the most popular men in the hotel lobbies of the town. I think that'd be an odd designation for somebody today, to hang out in hotel lobbies. And you don't exactly, but you have a sense of this, the third house, as they called us, this realm where men gathered in saloons and hotel lobbies and public meeting places, even on the square, to talk about the public affairs of the day outside of the realm. Well, let's see if we can, you can get in the, you get a whole detailed, and we basically walk you around through these elaborate, detailed descriptions, walk you around each of the worlds in which these people lived, and then we break it down to the individual level. You can follow John Sheedy through his daily tracking from his house at the southeast corner of 12th and P Street that he and his wife built a number of years before, to his casino 2 blocks to the west, to the Capitol Hotel, where the Georgian apartment building, or the YMCA, is today, where he hung out a lot. And likewise, he was quite interested in encouraging the new Lincoln Hotel, which was not quite open in January of 1891. You can look at the casino. You can go back and follow up with the Uptown District and how it was arranged and how it was organized. John Sheedy had a hotel catty-corner to his casino. The hotel was dubious in terms of its reputation. This is mentioned even in Seacrest's memoirs of the Lincoln Evening News, that there was a brothel down the street. John Sheedy had a wide-open sense of maintaining a public life, and he didn't see anything wrong with that. He thought it was good for the town and it good for his business as well. And so every character involved in this, Tunis P. Quick, who owned the building in which the Sheedy Casino was located on the second floor, likewise, Harry Wallstrom. Other folks, this was the alleged lover of Mary Sheedy, the traveling salesman with whom she had an affair, and he moved back to Lincoln, and that precipitated her desperate effort to get out of the marriage, etc. We give you all sorts of spatial narratives of the individuals, about 20 individuals, and about and the 5 or 6 various venues in which individuals operated. If you want to go to the lawyers, you can look at how lawyers operated, where they lived, where they worked, particularly things like the Burr Block, which is still standing today in its altered form, altered in the early 20th century. This is where you can see some of these photos, and I insisted that these photos have a zoom capacity, because that creates a kind of absorption. You can absorb into it, and if you look closely, sometimes these photos will elicit, give you information that we didn't have an ability previously to work out. I couldn't figure out what the numbers of the rooms were in the guideline, but of course lawyers painted all their names on the window, and this is fuzzing it out again. But I guarantee on a good computer it says Talbot and Bryan, and that's William Jennings Bryan's office. So whenever we walk by that building and guests are in town, I say look up to the third floor over. That's William Jennings Bryan at this time was sleeping in his office, did his own janitorial work. He was a person who lived downtown, and of course the commoner, when he opened a newspaper years later, wouldn't be very far away, etc. And so it gives you a sense of that lived experience in the past, and that's what I was really going after, the sense of spatial narratives, that as you and I move through a city, we create a track through the city. We create our own version of the city. We establish our relationship with the built environment, and we then begin by the memories that we have of those places, give that built environment a sense of meaning and purpose, and it becomes the place that we call home. It becomes a space that we have turned into a place. And everybody in a city does that. Cities are multiplicities of such stories, and I wanted to try to bring people back to the past through this interactive map and this sense of absorption within the city, and get a sense of walking around the 19th century city. And really, if you do this, you can go all the way back to the home, and I suppose since we don't have the interactive map, we can go to the photographs, where that's really the most straightforward way to do it. This is the document archive. You want to read legal documents, which are dry as dust then as they are now, but changed from script to typing in the 1890s, which is a real change. Right at this point, they changed from script, clerk script, to typing, and that must have been a technological breakthrough, because they're obviously much easier to read. You also have all the newspaper articles, but you also have an incredible cache of about 130 photographs that allow you to wander through Lincoln in the 19th century. And these photographs are individually connected to each of the units on the map. So when you go up and down O Street or across 13th Street over on P Street, you can literally go down, up and down the street where we have images. We have a fair number, but we don't have that many. For instance, Lincoln pales into comparison that the extraordinary collection that they have at the Omaha Public Library of downtown Omaha has. I wish that could be used someday in such kind of a thing. Wouldn't it be great if you had a map of downtown, interactive, so you could place things where they were? So you begin to have a sense of downtown 1891 in the same kind of interactive way that you and I place things about where something is around a corner, down a street, on that street, et cetera, as we're going around about the city and trying to figure out our comfort zones within the city. And that's what spatial arrangements are all about, spatial narratives. It's where you feel comfortable, it's where you like to cater to a business, it's where you like to go. It's the city within the city that each of us create, and that becomes a great way of trying to create this. So that was sort of the micro-historical impulse that led to my taking the plunge to move to a digital project and trying to create an interactive map of the 19th century city and give you a sense of the absorption of the city. And sometimes I go to the site and I spend much of my time just looking through the images and tracking through the images. And you can actually get a lot of things right off the images. If I just type in here one thing, for instance, about streets in 19th century Lincoln, for instance, when you look at some of the images, you can just get a sense of the lived environment of the street. And I particularly like this one of the Walsh and Putnam building, because you can see all the unbelievably cluttered street furniture that was on the street. If you can see there, there's a barber pole on the right. There's it's another kind of obelisk that's painted. I think that means that there are public baths inside. I'm not sure. There's an elephant hanging from the building next to it. And then there's this large mortar and pestle. We know what that means. It's a druggist, obviously. And next to that, there's a large clock. And you get a sense of, my goodness, these streets were cluttered. You also get a sense of how they used that wood sidewalk that was above the grade for basically debris. I guess this is garbage or things waiting to be stored. And some folks, things were changing so quick, they put a sign on the curb, or they sometimes just toss things right onto the curb. And so you can look through various photographs as you're going through it and kind of just explore the city and absorb yourself into it. Or if you type in Fitzgerald, and John Fitzgerald was one of the major characters involved in the case, an adversary of Sheedy's. Sometimes this is a great image of his house before it burned down in 1892 or 3, and he ended his life in 1895 living in his office. A lot of men apparently lived in their offices when they were unable to find a house. And you can see in some of these photos that, yes, people look back at the photographer, and here's somebody up on 20th and I think B Street in the Fitzgerald mansion that's long gone, disappeared in the 1890s, looking out the window. You've got a number of those images of people sitting in windows, and you can explore the city through the photographs, and the zoom effect allows you to get into that kind of absorption into the city and the lived experience of the city in the past. So the key here was the spatial narrative. If you want to get the formal element of the spatial narrative theory, well, we give it all to you, the theoretical background, but I think it's so intuitive and we so much understand this, it almost as if these tracks across the city become invisible to us and unreflective to us because we get so used to them. I live in a walking city. I'm a walker. I walk from the near south neighborhood into downtown just about every day and have for many years now. And I've got my certain tracks, and we all have our certain tracks, even in a driving city, which has a different kind of spatial relationship between yourself and the landscape around you. You will likewise have your own tracks and where you feel comfortable with the traffic patterns, et cetera. And so that's a lot of the exploration, the desire to create these kind of elaborate kind of spatial narratives that would try to tie this all together and give you a sense of what was going on in the city. And the things that were going on were just a series of storylines that I fleshed out. And there was an ongoing dispute between reformers and boosters of the status quo. And the key breakthrough here was recognizing that when the reformers began to try to take over City Hall and ran a series of campaigns in the 1880s, which are detailed in the story here, look at the booster ethos and go down, scroll down to how John Sheedy became a marked man. John Sheedy was their target. He was the guy who had a casino flaunting the law, which was against prohibited gambling in Lincoln. There were the county laws, etc. And he was the guy right across from the courthouse, right literally around the corner from the lawyers, who was flaunting the law, and they wanted him out. He was a thorn in their side. And John Sheedy had run an operation with the police in which he had corrupted the police and the police judge, where he provided rents and payoffs. A typical garden variety kind of corruption that existed in every city of the kind in the 1880s and 1890s. And one of the police judges didn't want to play with him anymore, and they began to back off on the protection that they provided him. And in 1887, John Sheedy was arrested. He was pulled by the police, and he was arrested, and his joint was closed. And John Sheedy, rather than just letting it go and trying to find a new strategy to operate, decided to sue the police judge for not doing his job. And it led to this complicated effort. He sued the police judge in front of the city council, a very cynical kind of thing to do. And the city council took the bait. They replaced the police judge. The police judge had a federal court say that the city council had acted beyond its ability to act. It led to the arrest and incarceration of the mayor and the city council in this elaborate sort of staged theatrical event. They were put in prison in Omaha. It was an extraordinary event. And John Sheedy was the cause of all their trouble. And he becomes the marked man. And a number of times between 87 and 91, including in December of 1890, somebody tried to assault him. He increasingly was aware that there were people in town who wanted him gone, and he was the target of their activities. And so there was this increasing tension between the reformers who wanted to clean up Lincoln and John Sheedy and the folks who wanted to just kind of continue with the status quo, a wide open town. I've recently read a book by Alicia Barber about Reno, Nevada at the same period, and I was delighted to find that they had exactly the same kind of dispute in the booster ethos happening there, that there was this divide between the clean up the town, prohibition, get gambling, prostitution out of the town, or keep it wide open, because wide open is good for business. And of course, we know the direction Reno went. They went toward gambling, the divorce capital of America, and prostitution didn't become illegal in Reno until World War II. And so here's a whole thing that was going on, and John Sheedy was the key character there. There were also frustrations on a deeper story in the booster ethos about the direction that Lincoln was taking in terms of its economy. It wasn't growing as fast as people had hoped. It was living in the shadow of Omaha. The economics behind that are pretty clear. Omaha was a break of bulk at the Union Pacific system, and just east of Omaha, they had to pay much higher transit rates, and so no manufacturers would come to Lincoln. They would go to Omaha instead, where they had economies of scale in terms of operating their businesses and access to transportation. And so Lincoln was involved in that as well. So lots of stories underneath it. But there were also growing tensions, as I indicated, between men and women. This more open and outrageous, wide open town with male behavior downtown. Carlos Burr, the mayor, was involved in this as well. And more women of the working class, and here Mary Sheedy comes into play, were flaunting middle class constrictions on women's activities and behavior. I think we all know the cult of true womanhood and the cult of domesticity that provided a very narrow framework in which women could live in the 1850s or 40s through the 1890s, very aggressive even in the 1880s. And she was flaunting that, and she was one of those women who wanted to break out of those strictures, even as she married John Sheedy, a sort of on-the-edge booster fellow, and wanted to try to become respectable, although she had a pretty checkered past. She was twice divorced. Everybody in town knew who Mary Sheedy was as well, because she'd had a very messy divorce case back in the mid-1880s, and she was a known character on P Street and the whole uptown district, etc. So lots of things going on in the case. Now, I invite you then to look at all the documents, to look at the details of the photographic collection. It's an extraordinary collection. And then go to the interactive map and try to piece things together. And gradually, by reading the spatial narratives, by reading the narratives, you get just not a history of the case and the facts of the case. You get a sense of Lincoln, Nebraska, the Gilded Age city, and all the tensions that were in play at the time, right before modernism began to change the system and really lead to wholesale changes within the next 15 to 20 years. Now, that's where things stand. In terms of interactiveness, in terms of the site itself, we've had lots of good feedback. I want to thank Joy Sitta of the Police Department of Lincoln, who's a real fan of the site, and she and I have been in communication any number of times about her interest in the site. Likewise, Tom Cassidy, the police chief, has blogged the site a number of times on his blog. I'm thankful to him for drawing attention to it. I'm also thankful for other people in the town who've been supportive, some critical, because the navigational issues keep coming up. In many ways, this is a first effort. I see this as maturing, making it a little more user-friendly, and on the other hand, I think the complexity of it reflects the desire here to give you a sense of the complexity of lived experience in a city, and so I don't want to go too much. I've done the narrative, put into the narrative framework, which is the linear framework of an article. I want to keep this wide open to allow people to interact with it in all sorts of ways, and people who use the site, and including myself, I've never used it the same way, and I never end up in the same place after half an hour of being in the site. You're always going in different directions. But as I reflect on this and I think about revisions of the site and updates of the site, I'm increasingly struck by the fact that I may have missed something that was right before my eyes, which was the debate about the press. There was debate about the law and ethics. There was debate about the moral environment of the town and the wide open environment of the town. But there was also a debate about the professional standards in newspapers and the professional standards of reporting. The yellow press was very big at the time. And the yellow press was very interested in selling newspapers by telling elaborate stories right out of the Police Gazette, which was a paper that would tell great murder stories. And this had all the characteristics. I've been convinced that this they didn't get them, and they got away with murder. That's my sense of what's going on here. And that's not going to be very much of a motivation for somebody to reopen the case, if you know what I mean. And so here's a sense that I just think the case was left to sit there and stay on the books, and then at some point in the 1930s or 40s it was officially just closed. What I'd love to know is where the evidence box went. In the court case itself, after they had buried John Sheedy, the prosecution wanted to give clear evidence of the damage to his skull, so they exhumed John Sheedy's body. His tomb's still out there in St. Teresa Cemetery. You can go visit it. It's midway between O Street and the parking lot to the south. It's a very nice tomb, and it's got a picture of it on the website. But they exhumed his body and removed his skull. They then prepared the skull, and the attorneys brought the skull into court, which would be immediately ruled out today as inflammatory, extraordinary inflammatory. And everybody even then they say everybody just was silent and shocked, like, oh my goodness. And there's the hit in the broken skull in the back, and that was John Sheedy. And clearly this was entered into evidence along with a detailed map of his house and the immediate surroundings, which I would love to get my hands on. But there's no evidence in the police department that any of those boxes of evidence from the last 2 centuries ago have survived. They were all gone, and I suspect they were thrown away at some point, but they certainly didn't survive the move. Whenever you build a new building, it's always a dangerous time for archives. Any historian knows that.
Say the website again. How do we find it?
Website, gildedage.unl.edu. Just type it into a Google search on top and you'll get to it. If you don't get it to there, go to the Center for Digital Research and Humanities at the university. Go to the Plains Humanities Alliance within the Center for Great Plains Studies website at the university, or even go to my personal website at the History Department at the university. There's 3 ways to get to it, but the first way is probably going to get you there.
Was the prosecutor's career affected by this? Was it boosted? You mentioned the prosecutor.
Well, the prosecutor who actually sort of, Frank Hall was one of them, and Frank Hall is, if you're knowledgeable about Lincoln history, you're shaking your head. He was an art collector, and his art collection would become an important part of the beginning of the Sheldon collection. He was a lawyer, very prominent lawyer, actually was one of the lawyers who started a firm that's still in operation here in Lincoln, Nebraska, Klein Williams, in the U.S. Bank building. And he was a very prominent lawyer, so apparently it didn't. He was known at the time as a railroad lawyer without much criminal experience, but quite frankly, when you look at the realities of the case, it wasn't a very good case that they put against McFarland or Mary Sheedy, and it's probable that they would have lost. The other fellow, Genio Lambertson, was one of the most prominent attorneys of the time. He had been the attorney who freed the city council and the mayor from federal prison by rushing to Washington, D.C. and getting a federal Supreme Court judge to declare the district judge out of line and overrule them. And so he was well known. He was one of the most prominent lawyers at the time, and he went on to a long and a notable career in Lincoln. So no, it didn't affect either of them. And when Jesse Strode died years later, the thing they mentioned in his obituary was that as the defense lawyer, he made his name by the defense of Monday McFarland and Mary Sheedy. So here it was in the 1930s. They remembered back to his great case 40 years before. And so for Jesse Strode, it was a real nice step forward. Other than that, I don't think most lawyers, and I've asked lawyers when I was writing the article, I've asked some lawyers at Klein Williams to look at it. I don't think they think much of the law of the case. That's my impression. Well, thank you so much. I enjoyed it.